Okay, so let's begin. So, yeah, good question. Why are we here? So, contract management is given much more prominence in the Procurement Act 2023 than it is in the current regime under the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. So there are a few sections that specifically cover off contract management. So one of these is that under section 52, before entering into a public contract with an estimated value of more than £5 million, a contracting authority must set at least 3 key performance indicators in respect of the contract. And a contracting authority must publish any KPIs that it sets under section 52(1). And then under section 71(2), at least once in every 12-month period during the life cycle of the contract and on termination, the contracting authority must firstly assess performance against the key performance indicators and publish information specified in regulations that are brought in under section 95. Now, we do now have draft transparency regulations. They have been drafted and should be in force, I suspect, pretty soon. And they do indeed contain that information, and all of those points that I've touched on briefly in this introductory slide, I will cover in more detail as we go through the session. So what will we cover today? So planning your contracts for the year and what I'm calling the big clash for the education sector. And we'll touch on that for sort of at the beginning. When do you need to start thinking about your KPIs and contract management? We'll think a little bit about how to agree those KPIs and what's an acceptable level of negotiation on those, how to monitor your KPIs and manage contracts well, the reporting requirements and sort of general performance management. So the first element of this is transparency. Now, this is, it kind of really is the golden thread that runs through all of the new procurement regime. So they are embedded into every stage of the procurement process. And as I've mentioned briefly already, there was consultation on secondary legislation last summer. We now have the transparency regulations, which will be brought into force shortly. And there is a wide range of notices that must be published. And this is when we're talking about transparency, a lot of that is in the notices that the Act requires you as contracting authorities to publish. The ones that we are going to be most focused on today is the pipeline notice and the contract performance notice. And basically any procurements that go live after the go live date or started after the go live date will be subject to the Act. We do now have a date that is pretty much set in stone as the 28th of October 2024, which means we are about 6 months away from that date now. And the PCR will continue to apply to those procurements started before that date. I will just briefly say that this presentation is about the Procurement Act. I am conscious that we may have colleagues from Scottish universities on this call. Now, the Procurement Act is not generally going to be applicable to Scotland. Scotland has made the decision to retain the existing regime, which is much more closely linked to the EU. I am sure that over time there will be elements of that change to bring a level of consistency, but at the moment the Act only applies to either reserved matters that are still procured by the UK government, which for the most part will not affect universities, and or procurements that cover both England and Scotland. And it could well be that there are some smaller consortia of universities that work together for various reasons that cross the border between England and Scotland, and then Scottish universities may well have to be aware of the intricacies and the detail of the Procurement Act 2023, but certainly on a day-to-day basis, the majority of activity for Scottish universities will remain under the current regulations. So let's talk about pipeline management first. So Section 93 requires a pipeline notice to be published, setting out details of proposed contracts valued at over £2 million per contract. However, this does only apply to authorities that consider that they will pay more than £100 million under their relevant contracts every year. An irrelevant contract is any contract for the supply of goods, services or works other than exempted contracts. Contract set out in Schedule 2 of the Procurement Act and cover things like, what we have at the moment, TECAL contracts, horizontal arrangements which are based on the handbook waste exemption. We have, financial services, land transactions, legal services if it's litigation. All the normal range that we know and love at the moment are all exempted contracts set out under in Schedule 2 of the Act. The 100 million does include contracts that the authority expects to direct award without competition. So that is an interesting reflection on how government expects contracting authorities to be able to anticipate some of that. Now, obviously, there are going to be some that come under the urgency provisions for direct award that you will not be able to set out in your pipeline notices. But I think the important thing to sort of recognise is what comes within that £100 million of spend. So it is spend on contract, but that could be capital spend that goes for for building projects or for IT infrastructure refreshes, for example. It could be works contracts for the development of a new laboratory, services contracts. So anything that relates to those contracts for services, goods or works will come within 100 million. Will come within that 100 million pounds. So for some universities that may not be an issue, for very small universities, but there are a lot of universities that obviously do meet that threshold. It's very much seen as a positive for suppliers and for preparing the market for procurement, because it lets the market know about upcoming opportunities. And it is really something that contracting authorities can start thinking about now in terms of how to plan procurements and resources. And even when there is no requirement to publish, as in you don't meet that £100 million threshold, it is a really good thing to get in place and to start having a sort of best practice approach to planning your procurements well in advance. So the big clash. So this is an issue for HE and for the other parts of the education sector as well, because the financial year to which a pipeline notices have to apply is currently defined in Section 93(4) as a 12-month period beginning with the 1st of April, following the day on which the section comes into force. So basically, on the basis that the Act comes into force pretty much fully on the 28th of October 2024, we are talking about the 1st of April 2025 as the first date. And the way the legislation works is that you have, I think it's a 56-day period, no idea where that comes from, a 56-day period in which to publish your pipeline notice after the 1st of April 2025, and then it's every successive 12 months. So how do we square this circle for HE? Well, I'm afraid to say that currently there is no simple answer to that. One could argue that you take a purposive approach to the interpretation of the legislation and think that the financial year was chosen to start on the 1st of April because that's when, for government departments and for the majority of the public sector, that is when the financial year starts. So local government, NHS all start on the 1st of April, and arguably for parts of the public sector contracting authorities that have a different financial year, that would be acceptable. But I think it is really worth getting more clarity on this, and I'm certainly talking to people about how best we can raise this with Cabinet Office and get an answer. But the good news is that because it's not the earliest we will have to do anything about this, actually publish a pipeline notice, is April 2025. We do have a bit more time to get this one sorted out, but at the moment there is a definite clash between what HE needs in terms of a financial year and what the legislation says. So it is a bit of a watch this space. So let's move on to contract management and how we factor this into the procurement. So is this a procurement issue at all, or is it just a contract management issue? Well, I can't stress strongly enough my view that it is not helpful to look at procurement and contract management in isolation from each other, because the procurement, a good procurement sets up a good contract. A good procurement should include a lot of information about the contract to make sure that it can then be managed properly and that it is delivered properly, because all the parties understand exactly what they should be doing. And sometimes setting KPIs, even at the moment, even before we've had this obligation to publish our KPIs, is a difficult balancing act. And that is because there is often a tension between the level of certainty and detail that a contracting authority wants to get from its supplier when it's looking at performance management, and what the supplier sees as a reasonable level of oversight and of information that needs to be provided to its customers. So inappropriate and burdensome KPIs can have a significant impact on both the procurement process and the contract delivery. But this is only likely to become more impactful and important when bidders know that the KPIs that they agree to during a procurement process are then going to be monitored and reported on publicly. Because from a supplier's perspective, you can completely understand why they think that that they want the KPIs to be relatively light touch or relatively easy to meet, so that they are more likely to be able to meet them, so that the reporting is positive. And we'll look later on in the slides as to how those ratings work for KPIs. But it is going to become more and more important to bidders that they get what they view as acceptable KPIs as part of a contract. This could lead to delays in the process, and also to the post-award negotiations with a successful supplier, which obviously puts, the start of the contract at risk to the contracting authority. There will be, and I don't really touch on this today because it's kind of a topic of its own right, contract modifications generally, but changes to KPIs could well be part of a contract modification to correct problems at a later date. But obviously the more you can get right now, the better you will be. So one thing to note is that while the pipeline notice has to publish contracts over a value of 2 million, the requirement to include 3 KPIs in contracts only bites for contracts of more than 5 million. And so for contracts with a lower value, there is no obligation to have these 3 KPIs that are measured against. And also, even if a contract has a value of more than 5 million, if a KPI cannot be properly, can't assess the performance of a contract, then you don't have to have them. Now, me and my team at Browne Jacobson have struggled to think of many reasons why that would not be the case. But one thing that I did just want to sort of pause on for a second in terms of the contracts that may well come into this bracket is in relation to construction contracts and contracts for works, because obviously that 5 million threshold is close to the current threshold for works contracts. Capital build or capital projects are often some of the most high value contracts that a university will have, and of course they often use standard contracts like JCTs or NEC contracts. Now, I'm not a construction lawyer. I find standard construction contracts, not always in alignment with public procurement principles and how you are meant to draft contracts from a public procurement perspective, and they do not do contract management in the same way as, say, a contract that we would draft for an IT solution. So actually, it's going to be really important to think about how some of these standard contracts can have KPIs written into them, when at the moment they're not really set up for that type of performance monitoring all the time. So I think I just really wanted to sort of emphasize those kinds of contracts, because I think that's where a lot more thought will have to go into to setting up these KPIs. And as I said, because of the value threshold for the KPIs and the value of construction contracts, I think quite often those two are going to go hand in hand. So during the life of the contract, authorities are going to have to proactively monitor their contracts against these KPIs so that they can do the reporting, which we're going to come on to in slides near the end. And overall, it is so important to get all of this right. So to get the right KPIs, the right sort of level of KPIs, and agree the performance monitoring with your supplier, because the consequences to suppliers is that this information could be used for them to be excluded from future procurements due to poor performance. Again, I will touch on that later on. But I guess what I'm wanting to do here is really set the scene on as to why all of this is really important to think about really early on in your procurement, so that you can get it right and make sure that you're comfortable that at a later stage this is all going to work properly. So there are some exceptions to having to have KPIs and measure and report. Framework agreements is one, although as I've said at the bottom of that slide, this does not mean call-off contracts from frameworks do not need to have KPIs in them. They do. They are contracts in their own right, and you can tell from the legislation that they talk about frameworks and public contracts that are awarded from a framework. So public contracts very much still within this in terms of call-off contracts. But I do think it's going to be a really interesting point to think about in terms of at what stage do those KPIs go in? Will those KPIs be on a call-off contract specific basis, or will framework authorities, sort of central purchasing bodies, will they set standard KPIs for all call-off contracts at the point of setting up the framework? And this is something that a colleague and I are going to be having to give some more thought to in a few weeks when we're delivering some training to government legal department. So it's something that I think there will be more to think about over the coming weeks and months, and we will do our best to share those thoughts with you at the appropriate time. A few of the contracts which, utilities, obviously unlikely to affect universities, but concession contracts are not covered by this, and light touch regime contracts, which for some contracts for HE could be very helpful, because, we have, light touch regime contracts have not changed substantially in terms of the types of services that come under the LTR. So a lot of stuff to do with education and research, etc., will already be, will still be covered by that. So that will take out a chunk of contracts for you. Although, as I said earlier, for best practice purposes, it's probably good to be thinking about these things anyway. But there will be no obligation to report on them. So let's start at the very beginning. So as I've mentioned already, pipeline notices, you could consider giving an indication of KPIs for your big contracts, and you could give an indication to the market that you would like to discuss these as part of market engagement before you start running the process formally. I think market engagement is the perfect time to start introducing potential KPIs to see how the market reacts to them. I have over the years been involved with clients that have done this very thing, and it has proved very useful to understand where the market sits. Obviously, you don't have to be entirely led by the market. You have to do what's right for your organisation, but it is so much better to have suppliers on board at the beginning, before the procurement process formally starts, to ensure that you are going to have as smooth a procurement and contract finalisation process as possible. So, should your approach to planning change under the Act as opposed to what you do now? Well, as now, there's no set format. It depends on the nature and complexity of the contract and the pool of the suppliers that you have. Is it more important under the Act? Well, I guess you could, short answer, yes, I believe so. Not only because of the KPIs, but also because of the change to the procedures. So the competitive flexible procedure, which you will have a great amount of discretion over what that procedure looks like. This will help you get the best out of it by testing with the market what you're going to do. Hopefully it will reduce the need for interim modifications of the contract if you've talked through some of the potentially trickier issues with suppliers. And it really does allow you to sort of help crystallise how the procurement's going to assist you in achieving strategic objectives or key policy points, if you are able to understand from a market perspective where they're going to be in supporting you with that. So at the tender stage, which procedure should you use? Well, we do only have two now. So we have the open procedure and the competitive flexible procedure. Open procedure is pretty similar to what we have at the moment. In terms of these bigger, higher value contracts that you need to have your KPIs in, it could still be very appropriate to have an open procedure because it could be for pretty simple services, or it could be for a contract where you believe that there are going to be a very small pool of bidders and actually you don't feel the need to down select, because even though it's the open procedure, there is still more flexibility than we currently have in terms of what you can do during the open procedure in terms of running it. So if you think it's something that can be a paper-based exercise and you don't need to down select bidders because you're not going to have a huge number of them, then you may still use the open procedure. For a lot of contracts of 5 million and above, it may be more appropriate to use the competitive flexible procedure, which, you know, if you want to think about it in terms of the procedures that we currently have to try and give it some sort of like context and kind of centering, your competitive flexible procedure could look like anything from a standard restricted procedure where you are using it mainly to down select because you think you might have a large number of bidders, all the way through to the most complex of competitive dialogues with multiple stages, successive reductions in number of bidders and everything in between. Because you do have the flexibility to do that, and that again is a whole other session in terms of what the competitive flexible procedure could look like, and how you understand the framework within which it's all going to work. But in terms of the KPIs, obviously again they will be more nuanced, they might be more complex. The more complex your procurement is and the more complex your contract is. And during your tender stage, you can change the documents during the procurement. There is a way to do that, and we will think about that a bit more in a second. So I've touched on some of this slide already, and so I'll canter through it pretty quickly. As I said, we've got the two procedures. Probably something that is worth noting is that, you know, there is no default procedure anymore. So default under the PCR is open or restricted. You need a reason that's set out in Regulation 26 of the PCR to use the competitive dialogue or competitive procedure with negotiation. You don't need a justification anymore. If you are setting up and running a dynamic market, which is the new version of the DPS, then you must use the competitive flexible to do that. So a few more words on competitive flexible procedure, what we're calling CFP. As I talked about, a sort of framework and a structure to how you do that. The word that comes out a lot in the Procurement Act is proportionality, or being proportionate. And so deciding how to design your process, deciding what KPIs you're going to use, have to be proportionate to the nature, complexity and cost of the contract. And I think, you know, when it comes to challenges under the new regime, I suspect a lot of challenges we're going to see are about proportionality and testing that, which is interesting because that's not really something that is tested at the moment. Very regularly, I can think of a very small number of cases where that is the case. It is more akin with challenges under things like judicial review. So it'll be interesting to see maybe where there's more crossover between some of the case law there to look at what proportionality actually means. But I'm getting my procurement geek on here, so I will stop and move on. So yeah, there are very few detailed rules about how you run your procurement. So there are, however, in the Procurement Act, principles and objectives. And as I said, challenges are likely to be based around adherence to the principles, which are not. There's a whole section of the Act called Principles and Objectives, and then there are no principles set out in that part of the Act. So you have to take it that the principles are spread out throughout the whole Act and are, include things like proportionality. The EU freedoms are obviously no longer relevant, so things like freedom, free movement of goods, free movement of persons, which was actually, although very rarely talked about in terms of the PCR, are actually very fundamental to the original directives around procurement. There is no equivalent to Regulation 18, which is the equal treatment and transparency, but the Act does mention proportionality an awful lot. There is also reference to the National Procurement Policy Statement, which has already been published, was published a little while ago. Worth a read if you've got a free couple of hours and you fancy something stimulating. And then we also have objectives, which are set out, thank goodness. Something is pretty clear. Must have regard to the importance of delivering value for money, maximising public benefit, sharing information for the purposes of allowing suppliers and others to understand the procurement policies. So really, and acting with integrity. And really, once you get into this, sharing of information, acting with integrity, treating suppliers the same, equal treatment and transparency actually are there. They're just under a different phrase or term, and in a maybe sort of approached in a slightly different way, but very much still thinking about how to treat all bidders equally and make sure that all bidders have the same information. I mentioned earlier about, can you change your KPIs during a procurement process? And the answer is yes, but so it is much clearer in the Procurement Act that you are able to refine your tender documents, but then you must republish your tender notice and the associated documents. And I think the reason for this is that what government is trying to sort of cut down on is procurements that kind of quite considerably change their scope over the length of the tender process. And of course, the bidders that are in that process are aware of that, but there may be other people in the market who think, oh gosh, well, if that had been the proposal at the outset, then that would have changed how I bid, or I would have bid in a situation when I didn't. And so it's this transparency point. It's about being very clear with the market as to what's going on. This can not happen once tenders have been submitted. So obviously that would be incredibly unfair to all bidders that have submitted a tender if then there were changes made, but it can happen up to that point. The limitation on it is that the refinement can't be such that it would have altered an earlier assessment. And by that, what it means is that it wouldn't have changed the outcome of an earlier stage in the process. So at the SQ stage, or if you're in a multi-stage process and you're reducing the number of bidders at each stage, then the change to the refinement of the documents wouldn't have impacted on that. So for things like KPIs, you could see a situation where during a tender process, it becomes apparent that a KPI has been drafted in a way that is now no longer fully meeting the requirements of the authority, or there is some change to another change in the contract that has a knock-on impact on the KPI. So there is the ability to make those changes, but you do have to always reflect on whether that would have impacted on how bidders acted at an earlier stage in the process. So then we get onto awarding your contract. Now, again, you know, there's a lack of detail in that we currently have in the PCR. You know, now at the moment we are told very clearly that it's only competitive procedure with negotiation and competitive dialogue that have the ability to negotiate on the contract terms, and it's only competitive dialogue that you have the ability to, you know, refine and improve the offer of the bidder, preferred bidder at preferred bidder stage. So we don't have that in the Act, but you obviously still need to always think about principles and objectives, you know, treating all the bidders the same. So if we're thinking about KPIs and you're negotiating those with your preferred bidder, obviously query whether those new, updated, refined, you know, varied KPIs would have made a difference to bidders at an earlier stage. And I think one way to think about this, as we do at the moment, is to look at the test under Regulation 72 of the PCR, which is an amended version of that is in the Act. It is actually, I feel, slightly structured, slightly better in terms of how it's set out in the Act. But you can ask yourself the question, like, if we change the KPI in this way, would it be classed as a substantial modification under the modification provisions? And that's a good way to test whether it would have impacted on the procurement at an earlier stage. And then also, you know, would the change to these KPIs be seen as proportionate? So, you know, that theme of proportionality is maybe the other golden thread running through the Procurement Act. So I think what we can't underestimate the importance of is preparation and documentation. So because we don't have process-driven rules in quite the same way anymore, both contracting authorities and bidders may not be sure about exactly what is going to happen, as in there's no expectation from the Act that you can think, okay, well, this is a competitive dialogue procedure, or this is the restrict, so I can expect X, Y, and Z as part of this process. So contracting authorities are going to have to be really, really clear about documenting their proposed process. And they're going to have to be really, really clear as to where the flexibility lies in this. So in terms of thinking about contract management at a later stage, being very clear in the documents about what elements of the contract may be up for suggested amendments from bidders, negotiation with bidders, is really a key part of that. And as I've said before, you know, making the most of market engagement so that everyone, as much as possible, is on the same page at the point of the procurement going live. Because what we have to remember is that flexibility doesn't mean making it up as you go along. It means that you have flexibility process in the way that best fits your organisation, and the designing of that process then has to be articulated clearly in the tender documents, and any other information in contract notices, etc. So it's really, really important to get all of that right. So now we get on to the last few slides, but where we start having to think about what happens during the life of the contract and contract performance notices. So these are new because this whole reporting is new. And as I said before, Section 71 of the Act requires this annual reporting against the relevant KPIs. We have the transparency regulations now in draft, and Regulation 29 helpfully sets out what a contract performance notice has to include. And I guess this is something which is a variance, a difference to what we have at the moment under the PCR, because at the moment, while we have information in the PCR about, for example, what standstill letters need to include, and we have standard template notices that must be used, there isn't in the same way a list of all of the requirements of all of the notices in quite the same way that we have under these transparency regulations, because they are quite a lengthy document actually. And it goes through all of the different notices that are maybe required to be published, from from everything from pipeline notices, your market engagement notices, all the way through to these contract performance and to modification notices. So in all there are 14 notices, and they're all covered off in a relatively good amount of detail actually in the transparency regulations. There is a requirement to assess the performance against the KPIs. And if there is a breach of a public contract or a failure to perform, that information must be shared in the appropriate format at that 12-month mark of the contract term. So I guess that last point is just really to say that A, the information is set out in the regulations. B, I don't think you need to assume you don't have to remember all of this information, because I think we can assume that we are going to have standard notices that will be accessed in the way that you access standard notices at the moment, and that those notices will be set up to capture all of this information. But there is going to have to be a level of detail around some of it, which you will need to think about on a case-by-case basis. But it will also probably be good to think about having some standard drafting for your organisations, so that you're not having to take too much time over some of this, especially when you have maybe similar contracts with similar KPIs. Then trying to get to a point of having standard drafting will probably be really helpful. But why am I saying this? Because you have to rate the performance of your contractor against the KPIs that are published. There are 5 ratings that you can indicate, and they're set out there, and they are helpfully set out in the regulations as well. As part of Regulation 29, there is a table that sets these out. I tried to cut and paste the table in, and the formatting went horribly wrong, so I've just retyped them. But there is a helpful table in there that that might be a good thing, for example, to have in your if you have a kind of contract management handbook for your organisation, or part of your contract standing orders, to have that table in that document, so that it's very, very clear for everybody exactly what they're being asked to use as the way of rating the performance. So we can see there that good is meeting or exceeding, approaching target is close to meeting. I think requires improvement and inadequate, and possibly, those 3 in the middle, approaching target, requires improvement, and inadequate, is where you're going to get your challenges with your contractors, because you could take a very different interpretation of whether performance is close to, below, or significantly below the KPIs. Obviously, your supplier is, even if they recognise that they're not meeting all of their KPIs, they are going to want to be an approaching target. They're not going to be wanting to be requires improvement or inadequate. And you've got other, which performance can't be described as any of the above, which is very open to interpretation, and clearly meant for the sort of the worst of the worst situations. But you basically have to be able to say in your contract performance notice which of these ratings has been met. And where there is not, where performance of KPIs is not being met, so anything below good, you have to describe in the notice what the issue is. And again, I do think this is going to has the potential to create a lot of friction with suppliers, who again will not want lots of detail to be published. They might be worried about it impacting other contracts. They might be worried about it impacting financial performance. So if their banks get hold of this information, certainly if they are a PLC, which some big suppliers are, especially again thinking about both kind of IT tech stuff and construction, you've got some big suppliers that are in the FTSE and or an alternative market, and they've got shareholders to answer to. So obviously information about poor performance in contracts that is publicly available comes with risk for them. So that's in some ways a good stick and carrot to beat and dangle in front of them in terms of good performance. But I think that you will find that if things are published that they don't agree with, they are going to very strongly refute that information and ask you to change it, because it has a negative impact on them. So I guess one thing that you can think about is whether you have, as part of your contract management within your contracts, a way of attempting to agree the drafting of these contract performance notices with your supplier in advance of publishing them. And I can see many good reasons for that in terms of maintaining good relationships with your suppliers. Clearly, at the end of the day, you as the contracting authority have to have the last word, and you need to be comfortable that you are correctly reporting against contract performance. But I do think that there will have to be a bit of toing and froing, possibly a bit of compromising in terms of the drafting, but definitely having the ability to sort of build in that review and discussion on the rating and what information is going to be shared, I think will be really important to make contracts run smoothly. Otherwise, I can see an awful lot of contract disputes on the horizon that, frankly, nobody, maybe with the exception of dispute lawyers, of which I'm not one, would want to happen. So it's I think it's really important to think about all of that. One thing to note is that where the underperformance results in full termination of the contract, then you don't have to publish a contract performance notice, because you will be publishing a contract termination notice instead, which is another new notice under the Act. But there are also some other consequences of poor performance that I just wanted to touch on towards the end of this session. So I am less aware of this happening in universities, but certainly when I work with both central and local government, and you have elected members, either local councillors or MPs, there is often a lot of pressure on officers to exclude bidders from a process, because the elected member is aware of them performing badly under another contract, or they are aware of negative information in the press. They don't want their authority to be associated with that particular supplier. It is really difficult to exclude for poor past performance under the PCR. The Act widens this somewhat, widens the scope, because for the PCR to bite, the contract, the poor performance has to have been bad enough to either terminate the contract or result in a hefty damages remedy, so a financial penalty. Whereas here we've got situations where the supplier has failed to remedy a breach of the contract as being sufficient. Now, Schedule 7 of the Act sets out all of the discretionary grounds for excluding a bidder, and this discretionary ground is in relation to poor performance of a contract. It can be current performance as well. It must be sufficiently serious, and again, you can see how that is going to be interpreted differently between a contracting authority wanting to penalise a supplier for performance and the supplier not wanting to be penalised in that way for poor performance. So again, I think this is going to be something that could become very contentious, and so a contracting authority will still have to think really carefully about applying this test, and will have to use its judgment really on a case-by-case basis about how that is going to be reflected in the market. Different markets are more litigious than others, are more likely to push back on these things. So it's going to require market knowledge to really kind of decide whether it's an appropriate thing to do or not. And alongside that, the contracting authority must comply with the procurement objectives being fair and proportionate. So really thinking very carefully about whether excluding a bidder is actually fair and proportionate in the circumstances. But obviously, on the basis that publishing performance data makes poor performance more visible, I think there is more opportunity for other contracting authorities to make decisions about suppliers that they don't currently use. And that's why I think suppliers are going to be so keen to have a level of control over what is published about their performance in their performance contract performance notices. So just before we finish, just sort of some really practical thoughts on how you as universities and other contracting authorities can be preparing for contract management. And I think a lot of this is going to come down to having the right people with the right skills and the time to do this, because I don't think we should ignore the fact that this is, at all stages of the procurement, really adding in an additional requirement to the work of procurement officers and contract management teams. So really, even though you don't have to publish a pipeline until at least April next year, none of these procurements are going to start until 28th of October this year. Why don't you start doing a gap analysis now, pretty soon, to check that you do have the resources and the skill sets available to actively monitor contracts. Another thing, haven't put it on the slide, but just thinking about how do your contract and procurement teams currently work together? Do you think that the people who draft your procurement documents understand well enough how your contracts are managed to be able to draft relevant narrative into procurement documents about KPIs, how they're going to be managed, how the contract is going to be, monitored generally, etc. Because that will all have to be shared with bidders up front and centre as part of the procurement process. Do you think that your contract management teams and your legal teams, or your contract teams that help with the drafting of contracts, are able to draft effective KPIs? Have they had training on what is a good KPI? How to sort of practically test whether KPIs are going to work or not? Does all of your team have effective contract management skills to be able to take on data from the supplier, to evaluate that data and make an assessment based on those 5 performance ratings that were on a previous slide? How are you going to make sure that everyone has got that requisite skill set? Really helpfully, I think, will be to review your contracts that are in pipeline now. So for, probably mainly for your, new academic year starting in August, think about which of those contracts are going to be published after the 28th of October 2024, so that you can be thinking about which contracts are going to need that little bit extra attention in the first 6 months or so that everyone can get to grips with it all. And one way, I guess, to really help you think about what KPIs might look like in the future, how to draft them, is to look at KPIs in your existing contracts now. Are they as good as they could be? Could they be better? Have they actually helped to address performance issues, or are there things that you would, on reflection, change? So hopefully that has all been helpful. I realise, there is a lot to take in. Something that really is covered off in just a few sections of the Act, actually, once you start unpacking it, really does link to a lot of other sections. So, contract management is not just reviewing your KPIs once you've got a contract and monitoring them and publishing a notice. It really should start way before that, at the beginning of a procurement exercise, and flow all the way through. But I think that's all that we have time for today. Hopefully that has been useful. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk more about these things over the coming months, as well as we get closer to the 28th of October. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing those slides and hand back to Helen.
Thank you very much, Anja. It was a very insightful and interesting session, and I'm sure all of our members enjoyed the information you've provided today. We've got lots of great questions, so as I mentioned earlier, your questions have been collated. They will be shared with Anja, and then your consortium will share the responses with the slide deck very soon. So the next webinar in the series will be the new notices regime in the Procurement Act on the 14th of May. So look out for information coming soon from your consortium to book onto that session. And once again, thank you to Anja. Thanks to you all for attending today. That
Pleasure.
brings the session to a close. So have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.